This is a short video looking at the wealth of the wealthiest households in Great Britain. In 2008 to 2010, the Wealth and Assets Survey estimated aggregate total wealth, that is, the combined net wealth of all private households in Great Britain, at £10.3 trillion. Ordering households in ascending order based upon their total wealth allows us to look at the distribution of this wealth. The combined wealth of the bottom 50% of households accounted for less than 10% of total wealth. In comparison, the wealth held by the richest tenth of households represented a share of over 40%. This was 4 times greater than the wealth of the bottom half of all households combined, and over 850 times greater than that of the least wealthy tenth of households. Belonging to the least wealthy 10% of households required total wealth less than £13,000. In comparison, to belong to the wealthiest 10%, households required total wealth greater than £967,000. To belong to the wealthiest 1%, households were required to have total wealth greater than £2.8 million. The median household total wealth was £232,000. In other words, half of all households had total wealth less and half more than this amount. Now let's look at the distribution of the wealthiest households across the different regions of Great Britain. The South East had the biggest share of the wealthiest households. 15.5% of households in this region had wealth greater than £967,000. The lowest percentage was in Scotland, where only 6.9% of households were in the wealthiest 10% of the distribution. Considering Great Britain as a whole, we become aware of a north-south divide. There was a greater share of the wealthiest households in the south of the country. Household total wealth can be broken down into 4 components. Private pension wealth contributed over half to the total wealth held by the richest tenth of households. Private pension wealth contributed less than a third to the wealth of the bottom half of all households. Net property wealth contributed just over a quarter to the total wealth for the richest 10% of households. Property wealth was the largest component for those households in the bottom 50%. Financial wealth represented almost 13% of the total wealth held by the richest 10% of households, but contributed less than 4% for households in the bottom half of the distribution. Finally, we consider physical wealth, the total value of household possessions, valuables, etc. This component contributed almost a third of the wealth for the bottom 50% of households, but less than 5% for those households in the top decile. The share of total wealth between the 4 components was more even for the least wealthy half of households, whereas over 3/4 of the wealth of the wealthiest was invested in property and private pensions. Finally, we will examine 2 characteristics of the head of the household. More than half of the household heads in the wealthiest tenth of households had a degree-level qualification. For the least wealthy half of households, this percentage was more than 3 times lower. The percentage of household heads whose most recent occupation was at a managerial or professional level was also more than 3 times higher for the wealthiest 10% of households compared with the bottom half.